Thanks, everybody. Yeah, so as Pam said, I completed my Master's of Science in Sustainability Studies from Lenore-Ryan University, and basically this information comes from my master's thesis. So this is kind of a subset or a little bit of what I explored in my master's thesis, kind of just gonna get that out there today in less than an hour. So that's the goal for today. Okay, so first thing, just really quickly, we'll just get this out of the way. This is a code. There was a couple years ago, about 15,000 scientists from 180 countries, so all over the world, signed a letter to humanity. And this is what they said. A great change in our stewardship of the earth and the life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided. Humanity is pushing Earth's ecosystems beyond their capacity to support the web of life. We are fast approaching many of the limits of what the biosphere can tolerate without substantial and irreversible harm. And so I bring this up now because I do want to point out we are at a very troubling time right now. We're dealing with really severe environmental issues, including climate change and other issues. And the really blunt truth is that if we don't make serious efforts to address this in the next few decades, we're looking at serious problems. And this isn't that far down the road. We're talking about only a few decades down the road, well within the century, food and water shortages, drought, natural disasters, all kind of really serious problems for humanity and other life on this planet. Okay, so we got the doom and gloom out of the way. So now we're going to talk about solutions, and that's what's important anyway. That's what we should focus on. There are solutions out there. So today we're going to talk about one particular solution, which of course is plant-based diets, and how that can help the environment. And this is a really exciting, I think it's an exciting solution because it's one that we have more personal control over. There are a lot of issues out there that are very systemic, they're related to our infrastructure and policies that we don't have a lot of control over. But we do have a fair amount of control over what we eat every day. And so, it's a very empowering solution to me. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so before we get into the science, and this is going to be a little bit of a wide-ranging discussion towards the end, but before we get into the science, I want to define sustainability because I think having a working definition of sustainability is both interesting and can help frame the remainder of the discussion today. So one of the first kind of definitions of sustainability came from the UN, and basically what they define sustainability as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I do think this is a useful definition, although I would say it's incomplete. It definitely speaks to the basic material necessities. We have to make sure that we are preserving the environment in a way that allows us to preserve those basic material necessities, clean air, clean food, clean water for future generations. Another kind of way to think about sustainability, or a framework for sustainability, is the 3 pillars of sustainability. And what this basically says, this gets to the idea that sustainability is a holistic concept. It's about looking at the complexity of natural and human systems, and in this case, basically what this says is that you have the social, the economic, and the ecological. And you have to address all of those in balance if you want to create a sustainable society, a sustainable community, whatever it might be. If you neglect even one of the 3 legs, basically, or the 3 pillars, then the whole system can suffer. And then this is my favorite definition of sustainability, and this is kind of the working definition that I use that kind of guides my work, and that is the possibility that human and other life will flourish on the planet forever. And this comes from a gentleman named Dr. John Ehrenfeld, has a really incredible book called Sustainability by Design. But I love this definition, particularly because of the word flourish. Right? I think sustainability is an aspirational concept. It's about more than just, flourish right there. It's about more than just, again, those basic material necessities. That's super important, but we should be thinking bigger than that. We should be trying to create a world where all life can flourish. All people, all sentient life, all life in general. And when I say flourish, I mean basically have freedom and have the ability to live a good life. So that should be our goal when we're trying to work towards sustainability. A good life for all life on this planet. Okay, so let's jump into the science here. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the environmental impacts of agriculture in general. So basically what we have here, we have a situation, right? Agriculture is a miracle. It's a miracle that allows us to feed a massive human population. That being said, agriculture is by far the most environmentally destructive human endeavor. And so this poses a really serious challenge. How do we feed a growing human population? Because we're at 7.5 billion people right now, and it's going to continue to grow for the foreseeable future, while also reducing these impacts. So to give you an idea of the scale of the impact that agriculture has on the environment, here's some kind of like big picture facts to look at. So agriculture uses 43% of all ice and desert-free land on the entire planet. So we're talking about, of all the usable land that humans can use, basically, almost half of it is being used for agriculture. That's now, without future population growth. Agriculture is responsible for about 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. So fossil fuels are definitely the major contributor to climate change. They're the primary contributor, but agriculture is a major part of that issue, and we have to kind of address that. Agriculture is responsible for over 90% of humanity's freshwater footprint. So the vast majority of water that we use is being used for agriculture. And the freshwater footprint, just to make sure there's understanding there, that includes water use and water pollution. So it's like a kind of an all-encompassing figure for looking at humanity's use of water, whether, again, water use or water pollution. And then it's the largest contributor to biodiversity loss globally. So agriculture is the major driver of basically species extinction, of plants and animals being driven to extinction. That's largely related to agriculture, and it's because of these other things here. Biodiversity loss, the major driver, is habitat loss. It's habitat destruction, and that's right there. We're using a tremendous amount of land, basically, that's being taken from plants and animals and being used to grow food for humans. So this gives you a general idea of the scale of the environmental degradation caused by agriculture. Okay, so the real question that we're going to ask today is, what are the environmental impacts of eating plants versus eating animal products? And there's a lot of things that we need to do to create a sustainable food system, right? We need to eat more local food. We need to reduce food waste. That's a huge one, actually. Food waste has significant environmental impacts. And we need to support regenerative agricultural systems that kind of work with nature as opposed to kind of fighting nature, so to speak. But what we find based on the science is that this question here, plants versus animals, what are we consuming? That is the biggest factor as far as the impacts it has in determining the environmental impact of the food we eat. This is the biggest factor. All right, so I want to start by looking at water quality. And I start here because this is happening right in our own backyard. Not so much in the mountains in western North Carolina, but on the eastern side of the state, we have a lot of big factory farms, particularly for poultry and pigs. Right? And so this is a manure lagoon. Basically, when you confine animals in really tight spaces and you have a lot of animals, it's really hard to deal with the waste. They produce a lot of waste. And so what happens is they basically just funnel all that waste into these lagoons. And this causes serious problems because this waste is it's not treated properly. So it leaches into groundwater, it runs off into surface waters, and it causes really severe water and even some air pollution. So we're talking about different bacterial pollution that threatens human health, different things like nitrate, arsenic, heavy metals get into the groundwater and surface water, nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, which eventually cause dead zones and other issues. And then there's some off-gassing from these lagoons that off-gas ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and other harmful air pollution, which again, this stuff is harmful to human health. So how can plant-based diets help this issue? Well, one study in 2012 found that vegetarian diets can reduce individual water footprint by 36%. So again, water footprint is use and pollution kind of together. So you could see a pretty significant reduction in water use or water footprint just by adopting a vegetarian diet. Okay, so let's talk about land use change for a moment. And this is actually maybe the most important kind of slide in the whole presentation because this is, I think, the crux of the argument is related to land use change. So land use change is basically any alteration of a natural environment by humans for whatever purpose, whether it's rural, urban, agricultural, whatever it might be. And so this often comes in the form of deforestation. That's a big one, obviously. So what we find, so one study, and this is one of the most thorough studies, this one right here, POR 2008, just last year, is one of the most thorough studies that kind of quantified agricultural impacts, right? And what they find is that animal excluding diets, so if the whole world adopted fully plant-based diets, just as a hypothetical, we could reduce agricultural land use by 76%. That is an incredible amount of land. Remember, agriculture as a whole is using 43% of all the ice and desert-free land on the planet, and we could reduce that by 3/4. How much land is that? Well, this is an area equivalent to an area 3 times the size of the United States, including Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. That's a lot of land. By basically adopting plant-based diets, we could revert a lot of agricultural land back to natural areas, which would have massive benefits for biodiversity, climate change, water quality, so on and so forth. And just to kind of reinforce this point, another study in 2016 found that a global vegan diet, again a hypothetical global vegan diet, would actually reduce cropland demand in 2050 compared to 2000 levels. And so what's incredible about that is that between 2000 and 2050, we're talking about 3 billion more people on the planet. We're going from about 6 billion in 2000 to 9 billion in 2050, roughly. And even with that much population growth, a 50% increase in the human population, if we all adopted plant-based diets, we could actually use less cropland than we were using in 2000. That's a huge deal for trying to create a sustainable society and address some of these most pressing environmental issues. Okay, so let's move into climate change. So climate change is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, right? This is like this massive issue. It's kind of bearing down on us, and we got to address this soon. So how can plant-based diets kind of help in that regard? Well, what we find, based on this is the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, they found that animal agriculture alone, just animal agriculture, is responsible for almost 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than the entire transportation sector. This means that eating animal products produces more greenhouse gases than every single car, boat, plane, and train combined in the entire world. It's hard to believe, but that's the fact of the matter here. And that's for various reasons related to agriculture. A lot of it is related to land use change. When you cut down trees or grasslands to create agricultural fields, all that carbon that's stored in the soil and it's stored in the trees, that's going to be released in the atmosphere. There's other issues with this as well, where particularly with cows, and ruminant animals, so cows, sheep, goats, they actually produce methane. They produce methane in their guts, and so they are the major source of methane pollution in the whole world. And methane pollution methane is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. So carbon dioxide is the major, driver of climate change, but methane is kind of number 2, and it's actually more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So it's a huge issue. So this was a 2016 study that kind of reviewed the literature. It looked at all the studies on the topic that basically reviewed the environmental impacts of dietary choice or various diets. And what they found is that of all the diets that were studied, vegan diets resulted in the lowest greenhouse gas emissions. And with that, there was a consistent trend where the lower the percentage of animal products in your diet, the lower the greenhouse gases were. So that was the major factor in determining the dietary greenhouse gas emissions, was how much meat and dairy and eggs are in your diet. And they found that vegan diets reduced dietary greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. So that's a huge chunk of emissions, because if we remember from the beginning that agriculture as a whole is responsible for 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and if we all adopted vegan diets, we could cut that in half. That's a huge chunk of global emissions. There's really tremendous potential there. So to kind of visualize this, like how big of a difference is in our food choices, right? So one study, this was in 2014, and this was another kind of review of the literature. They looked at all the life cycle assessments done on agricultural products. And life cycle assessments are basically, it's a tool scientists use to quantify the environmental impacts of various products. So in this case, they looked at agricultural products. And what they found is that animal products produce significantly and consistently more greenhouse gas emissions than plants. And this relationship held really steady. Even if you compare the highest emitting plants to the lowest emitting animal products, the plants still produce less emissions than the animal products. And incredibly, what they found, now this is an extreme example. Ruminant meat, again, that's cows. That is the highest emitting animal product. Legumes or beans, that's the lowest emitting plant product. Legumes are probably the best thing you can eat for the environment, by the way. Beans they're like the most environmentally friendly food there is. So ruminant meat, cow, is 280 times more carbon intensive than legumes. So think about that. If you replace a steak with beans, you are reducing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that meal by 280 times. It's a really, really big difference. So I want to make one last point about climate change. So what we had just looked at, we were basically looking at current annual emissions, reductions in current annual emissions. But that doesn't tell the full story. There's this other piece, carbon sequestration, right? Sequestration is pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's already been emitted, we need to pull it out of the atmosphere. So what we find is that the adoption of plant-based diets is one of the most promising strategies for pulling carbon that's already been emitted out of the atmosphere. And this is related back to that land use change piece, right? Because we could revert so much land from agriculture back to natural areas by adopting plant-based diets, as that land basically heals and restores itself, it would pull a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. So one study in 2017, and you can see these are all very recent studies trying to stick very closely to the science here. They found that restoring artificial pastures to 100% carbon storage basically just means taking artificial pastures and letting it rewild, letting it just become a natural area again, could sequester 108 petagrams of carbon. So what is a petagram of carbon? I don't even know, I can't visualize a petagram of carbon, but just for reference to try to understand what that means, about 8 petagrams of carbon was released from fossil fuel burning annually from 2000 to 2009. So basically, and the main point here to consider is that if we all adopted plant-based diets, we could reverse more than a decade's worth of fossil fuel emissions. It's like taking a whole decade's worth of burning of fossil fuels, taking all that carbon and sucking it into the land, letting the land kind of sequester all of that carbon. That's a huge, potential to reverse some of the impacts of climate change and lessen the impacts of climate change. And then finally, I'll make a point about biodiversity loss. So biodiversity loss is really important to me because we're dealing with a serious problem here, right? So in the last 250 million years, the Earth has experienced 5 mass extinctions. These were all natural, well before humans. The last of those was the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. And a mass extinction is basically when, I forget the exact number, but a very large amount of the species on the planet go extinct. Right now, because of human actions, we are currently moving into the 6th great mass extinction of life on Earth. And this is strictly caused by humans. And this is a real tragedy to me because we share this planet with other species, and they have just as much right to exist here as we do. And so when we drive these species to extinction, they're gone forever. That's it, there's no going back. So what we find, and this is the title of a 2015 study, and it doesn't get much more clear than this, biodiversity conservation. The key is reducing meat consumption. Consuming animal products is by far the leading cause of biodiversity loss. And this is for the reasons we were talking about today, right? So biodiversity loss is primarily caused by A, habitat loss. Well, consuming animal products is the leading cause of habitat loss, habitat destruction. Biodiversity loss, another major driver, is overexploitation, which is basically the direct consumption of wild animals, so fishing and hunting. That's another major contributor to biodiversity loss. And then other things that contribute to biodiversity loss, climate change is another big one. Again, you can see that consuming animal products is a big contributor to climate change. So when you kind of bring all that together, this is what we find. So if we want to reverse biodiversity loss, if we want to save those rare and endangered species, eating a plant-based diet is one of the absolute best things we can do to make that a reality. Okay. So I get this question a lot, so I do want to address this. What about pastured or organic agriculture? Because I'm sure some of you are thinking about this, and it's a good question. Does eating animal products from pastured or organic systems, is that better for the environment than consuming kind of the conventional or factory farmed animal products? So let's look at this for a minute. So this is a graph. This came from a 2017 study, similar to one of the ones we discussed before, but it had about 750 life cycle assessments. Again, the tools that scientists use to quantify the environmental impact of various products. So they took these 750 life cycle assessments on different agricultural products, and they put all that data together. And this is basically a culmination of all that data. This particularly is greenhouse gas emissions per calorie for the food items. So what you find is blue is organic, red is conventional. These 5 over here are animal products, so beef, pork, poultry, eggs, and milk. So I want to point out a few things. First thing is that you can see with these graphs, there's very little difference between the organic and the conventional. That the pastured animal product is actually, from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, extremely similar to the factory farmed variety. And in some cases, with beef and with poultry, it's actually slightly worse, that the organic variety actually produces more greenhouse gas emissions. And I know this is surprising, but this is really what the science is showing us. A second thing I want to point out, over here you find 4 common crops, like 4 of the most common crop or plant products: corn, rice, wheat, and potatoes. And the main thing to point out here is that all 4 of these have produced significantly less greenhouse gas emissions than all of the animal products, regardless of system. So when we're talking about environmental impact, you're much better off. Even if there's some environmental benefit, I do leave open that there could be some environmental benefit to eating pastured animal products, but it's much, much better to just eat plants. So here's a similar graph, but this is land use per calorie. So previous we were looking at greenhouse gas emissions, this is land use. And you see a very, very similar relationship here, where the difference between organic and conventional is not much, if at all. And in fact, when we're talking about land use, organic beef and organic poultry actually requires a lot more land than factory farmed beef and poultry. And this makes sense because, look, factory farming is torturous. It's a really horrible thing. But it is more efficient. It's done because it is more efficient. You can cram animals in a very small amount of space, and even with the feed crops that they're feeding these animals, you're still using a lot less land than in pastured systems. And again, the crops have use a much smaller amount of land than all of the animal products. And before we move on, I do want to point out one other thing, and you can see on both graphs, beef is by far the highest emitting or the worst for the environment compared to anything else. So if you're going to cut out one thing or start with one thing, start with beef. Start with red meat, because really beef is incredibly unsustainable. It just requires a tremendous amount of land, it requires a tremendous amount of water, and it produces a lot of greenhouse gases to produce beef, lamb, basically any of those ruminant animals. Okay, so why is this the case? Why is it that there's this consistent relationship? We keep seeing this, right, where regardless of system, eating plants is better for the environment than eating animals. And it's related to ecological energy transfer, okay? So converting plant calories to animal calories results in about 10% efficiency. So when an animal eats a plant, they're only going to be able to use about 10% of the available energy. 90% of it is lost as heat. And this is actually physics. This is the second law of thermodynamics in action here. Okay, and so what we find is that this is a pyramid, basically an energy pyramid for basically any ecosystem, right? And so at the bottom you have primary producers, which is plants and algae, and they're getting their energy directly from the sun. Okay, and then you move up the pyramid, and next you have herbivores, and then maybe omnivores, and at the top you have your top predators. And as you move up the food web, there's less and less energy available, because every time an organism eats another organism, again, you're losing 90% of that available energy. So in every ecosystem on Earth, the primary producers, the plants, or the algae, whatever it might be, they're going to have by far the most biomass, the most number of individuals. And as you move up, you're getting less and less. And so in every ecosystem, the top predators, relatively, have a very small number of individuals, and they have a very small amount of biomass. Okay, and this is this is physics. You can't break this. This is a very hard and fast physical law, basically. So what can this tell us? This basically explains why it's always better to eat plants. If you take one thing from this, just remember, the further you eat down, generally speaking, the further you eat down on the food web, which is usually it's going to be plants, that is going to have the smallest environmental impact because of physics, basically. And I think another thing this shows us, I'd like to explain, we have 7.5 billion humans on the planet. There's basically absolutely no way, there's no system that can allow 7.5 billion humans to occupy this top spot in the pyramid. Right now, we're basically acting as the top predators in every single ecosystem on Earth. that is inherently unsustainable. It cannot be sustained. The Earth's systems are going to break if we continue to basically operate like we're these top predators. We just can't do it with this many people on the planet. And so because of this inefficiency, what we find is that animal products use 83% of global farmland. So they're using the vast majority of farmland, but only produce 18% of global calories. And so we're using so much farmland to produce a really relatively small amount of the global calories. It's just much more efficient to produce plants for direct human consumption. So just a couple quotes here, which I think are really powerful. And this comes from Joseph Poore, who is one of the researchers who I cite in a couple of the studies today. And here's what he had to say about sustainable meat. And before he released his landmark study a couple of years ago, he actually went into it, and there's some quotes about this. He went into it basically, he wanted to see if there were sustainable meat, like what meat could you eat sustainably? And by the end of his study, he basically came out of that as a vegan, because what he found was this: avoiding consumption of animal products delivers far better environmental benefits than trying to purchase sustainable meat and dairy. A vegan diet is probably the single biggest way to reduce your impact on planet Earth. Not just greenhouse gases, but global acidification, which is air pollution, eutrophication, water pollution, land use, and water use. So across the board, this is what the science is starting to show us. This is what scientists are starting to say. Okay, so a few conclusions for this. This is the first part of the talk, and we're going to expand it a bit, kind of in the interest of having a holistic discussion about sustainability. We're not just going to talk about environmental science like what we've done so far. We're going to expand it. But for this first part, these are the conclusions. Animal product consumption is likely the single most environmentally destructive human behavior. It's the most environmentally destructive human behavior. And then, following from that, what we find is that we have no choice. We have to really massively reduce animal product consumption if we have any hope of basically creating a sustainable world and addressing the most pressing environmental issues like biodiversity loss, like climate change. And again, I think not only is the science pointing to this is a biophysical reality that we have to accept and try to work towards it. So in fact, I actually look at animal products similarly to fossil fuels. Something that maybe made sense at an earlier time, but today with the issues that we're facing with the growing human population, we need to work towards basically eradicating the use of fossil fuels and eradicating the use of animal products, or very close to it, if we have any hope of addressing these issues. Okay, so this is where I want to shift the talk a little bit. Because again, we're talking about sustainability. It's this holistic concept. We're trying to create a world where all life can flourish, not just address environmental issues. That's a huge part of it, but there's more to it. So one thing I think is really important is that creating sustainability is going to require a culture shift. So our culture in the Western world, it creates unsustainability. It breeds unsustainability. And culture is this concept, it's like hard to wrap your head around, but it's the values, the norms, the beliefs in society that kind of all come together that create a unique culture, from a small group up to the community, to the national, to the international level. There's culture at all those levels. So a couple things here. So virtually all people in the Western world have unsustainable lifestyles. That's just the reality, all of us. Even the people that make a lot of efforts, our lifestyles are still unsustainable. And that's not to say it's necessarily our fault. I think it's partially us to take responsibility for that, but also some of this is out of our control. Some of this is up to governments and it's up to corporations to change their behavior, and we don't have all the control over that. We can only do what we can do. But nonetheless, this is the society we live in, so we're all living unsustainably. So again, changing or creating a sustainable society will require changing the basic structure of our society. And to do that, we need to cultivate a culture shift, because when you shift the culture, that's going to have impacts on everything. That's going to have impacts on personal behavior, it's going to have impacts on governmental policy, on corporate policy, and it's going to create those systemic changes, those changes to our infrastructure, to our policies, to our institutions, that will lead to sustainability. Okay, so with that in mind, with the threat of losing the entire audience, you might all just leave, walk out. You're going to be like, no, I don't want to hear about veganism. I'm going to talk about veganism, okay? And that's because I think ethics. So veganism is this moral philosophy, and I'll get to that in a second, that can really help us create a sustainable society, okay? So ethics, it's a huge part of the culture shift we need, right? So we have ethical systems that are really prominent in our societies that create unsustainability. We have values and beliefs and norms that lead to unsustainability. And so when we're talking about a culture shift, we need to look at our ethical systems. We need to look at our morality and see, is this something that's good for people, for all life? Is this something that's going to help us create a sustainable world? So let's talk about veganism for a minute. And we'll come back, after I explain veganism, we'll come back and I'll explain why I think veganism can actually help that culture shift that we need. Okay, but first we need to define it so we understand what we're talking about. So veganism is a way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. So basically, to simplify that, veganism is basically a lifestyle and moral philosophy that says we should do our best not to exploit, harm, and be violent towards non-human animals. And the truth is, I actually think that's a sentiment that probably most of us share. We don't want to intentionally harm animals. We want animals to be able to live a life of freedom and to be free from needless harm, just like we want that for humans. So that's really all veganism asks us to do, is just to be mindful and consistent and think, what can we do to make sure that we are not contributing to harm and exploitation of animals? And so we could talk about the logical basis of veganism. There are philosophy books like this written about veganism that would bore you to death. It's fascinating in its own way, but it can get boring, right? So I think the logical base of veganism is there, and if you have questions, we can talk about that later. But the truth is, I think veganism is it's about empathy and it's about compassion as well, right? It's about having respect for animals like dogs, right? It's about respecting them and making sure that we don't cause them unnecessary harm. But it's not just about dogs, it's about pigs. Pigs are just like dogs. They're super intelligent animals, and we should respect pigs as well and do our best not to harm them. And even things like cuttlefish. They're pretty cute in their own way. And even insects, bees, right? We should respect all life on this planet, and in particular, sentient life that perceives the world around them, life that feels pain and pleasure, similar to the human condition. That requires a little extra attention, right? Because these animals, again, they want to live just like we do. They feel pain and pleasure just like we do. So we have to respect that at some level. Okay, so let's get back to that necessary culture shift. So I'll just say about veganism, I promote it here because obviously a plant-based diet is one huge part of veganism. Veganism is a little bit more all-encompassing than that. It's about also trying not to, let's say, buy products that are tested on animals, like just in a more holistic sense, trying not to exploit animals. But a plant-based diet is the major aspect of veganism, and so that's why I bring it up here. I know it might seem radical, and I don't want to push anything down your throat. So I guess what I'll say before moving on to this is that's something that's made a lot of sense for me, and I think veganism is powerful. It's an important social justice philosophy. But what I hope happens today is that whatever you decide for yourself, I hope you just come out of this, learned a thing or two, and just are open-minded and ready to explore in more depth what you're eating and your relationship to animals, and then decide for yourself what makes sense for you. What's the best way that you can in your life, contribute to a sustainable society and respect animals. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. I know it's controversial, so that's why I wanted to bring that up. Okay, so let's get back to this necessary culture shift. So I think when we're looking at sustainability, one way that can help with kind of visualizing this culture shift or thinking about this culture shift that we need is like right now we have something called the dominant ideology. And the dominant ideology is basically the dominant norms, beliefs, and values that are within our society that create unsustainability. These are the values, norms, and beliefs that are leading to unsustainability. And what we can do is we can identify what I call the sustainable ideology. And these are values, norms, and beliefs that that contrast with this and will help us create a sustainable world. And so these are what we should be promoting through our behavior, through our actions, through our speech, through our beliefs, if we want to move towards sustainability. So instead of exploitation, we have justice. Instead of greed, equity. Instead of ignorance, tolerance. Instead of selfishness, compassion. Instead of domination, we have freedom. Instead of individualism, collectivism. which just means, in this case, I know that can be a loaded term, but just means working together. We need to work together. We need to work, we face these huge issues, and we can't solve it as individuals. We need to work together at the community level, at the state level, the international, all the way up to solve these problems together as a human species. Instead of anthropocentrism, we have biocentrism, which just means that we view all life as having moral value, not just humans. All life has moral value, and all life deserves to be protected. Instead of reductionism, we have holism. And that just means instead of always just like really focusing on the component parts and studying just like individual component parts of things, we need to look at whole systems. How do whole systems function? Because we live in a complex world. Issues like climate change, the economy, these are super complex phenomena that can't be just taken down to their little component parts and studied. They have to be studied as a whole, right? And then instead of simplicity, we have complexity. We need to accept the complexity of the world, and when we do that, instead of trying to simplify things, oversimplify, then we can start to think a little more broadly and holistically and really pursue solutions that are really, really useful and are going to help us create a better world. Okay, so back to veganism. How does veganism relate to this? Well, what I believe is that veganism, a lot of these values, beliefs, norms also underpin veganism. And so when you adopt veganism, when you promote veganism, and I would say to a lesser degree, reducing animal product consumption, but veganism, because it's this very consistent moral philosophy, to much larger degree. What you're doing is you are actually promoting some of the most important aspects of this sustainable ideology. You're basically promoting that out into the world. You're creating a ripple effect. So veganism is totally underpinned by things like justice, equity, compassion, freedom, and biocentrism. And so when you adopt that, for instance, veganism inherently involves a lot of respect for the natural world, for the other animals that we share this planet with. And so when you adopt that, you're promoting that value out to the world, that we need to respect the natural world, we need to respect animals, respect these other creatures on this planet that we share this planet with. So that's basically the big point here, is that these things are highly interrelated, and it goes the other way too. I think when we promote sustainability through other ways, again, you're reinforcing these values and beliefs and norms, which makes veganism more acceptable. And so there's this kind of like interplay going on. So veganism is radical. When I say radical, I mean it gets to the root. It gets to the root of an issue. It is radical, but we're dealing with serious problems. We're at a crossroads in human history, and so I think we need radical solutions. And veganism is one of those radical solutions that can really push forward the sustainability transition. Okay, so I want to make a point about human health as we kind of near the end of this presentation. And I am not a health professional or nutrition professional by any means, and this talk's not about human health. But if I'm asking you to eat plants, I think it's fair to just take a brief look at the science and make sure I'm not asking you to do something that's unhealthy, right? Like, we all need to be healthy ourselves. That's a big part of sustainability. If humans are going to flourish, we all need to eat healthy diets so we can be healthy. So the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, this is the largest organization of nutrition professionals globally. It's also the organization that registers dietitians in this country, or it's I can't think of the word, but I don't think it's not regulatory agency, but professional association that basically, it's the one that certifies, that's the word I'm looking for, thank you. It certifies dietitians in the United States. And this is their official statement on vegetarian diets. Appropriately planned vegetarian, including vegan diets, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits for the prevention and treatment of certain diseases. So what are those certain diseases they're talking about? Well, they're talking about basically the most deadly chronic diseases in this country, where they're talking about heart disease is probably the biggest one. They're talking about high blood pressure and stroke. They're talking about diabetes and even certain types of cancer. And there's a lot of science showing that plant-based diets kind of help with preventing and treating those diseases. Now, that's not to say it's a magic bullet. That doesn't exist. Disease exists. We're never going to get rid of it, but it does help reduce those chances of developing those chronic illnesses. And they also go on to say, this is important, that appropriately planned vegan diets, so fully plant-based diets, are appropriate for all stages of the life cycle, including pregnant women, infants, all the way up to elderly, and even serious athletes. And And when I say the term well-balanced, I would say that for any diet. It doesn't matter what diet you're on, you need to eat a well-balanced diet. Whether you're eating meat or you're on a vegan diet, you shouldn't be eating a bunch of processed foods, a bunch of sugar. Not going to get into all of that, but I just want to kind of add that little asterisk. I say well-balanced vegan diet, but that's not specific to veganism. That's any diet needs to be well-balanced, and we need to think about the kind of food we're eating. And then just a last point, many world-class athletes are vegan or consuming plant-based diets. There's a new documentary that's just coming out called The Game Changers, and it basically talks about all of these serious athletes that are vegan now. This guy is Patrick Babamian. He's an Iranian-born German guy, and he is literally one of the strongest men in the world, and he's a dedicated vegan. And not like a bodybuilder strong, like strongman competition strong, like people that are legitimately the strongest people in the entire world, dedicated vegan. And then there's just millions of people thriving on a fully plant-based diet today. So I think what we find based on the science and some of this anecdotal evidence is that, if it's done correctly, fully plant-based diets are perfectly healthy. They're good for you. They actually prevent certain chronic diseases that are really prominent in our society. And so this is just on top of these environmental and sustainability benefits that are really the topic of today's talk. Okay, so, and this is basically what I leave you with. Veganism is about a vision of a better future. That's what we want. We want to create a world in which all life can flourish, right? And so when we're thinking about sustainability is this big all-encompassing concept. It's about a better future. I want to see a future where we have halted the environmental, these major environmental issues like climate change and biodiversity loss. A future where humanity lives in peace with the other animals and plants on this planet, the other species that we share this planet with. And I think veganism is a huge part of creating this better world, of creating the sustainable world. And plant-based diets, of course. Plant-based diets and veganism, which are related but distinct. Yeah, so that's what it's about. It's a vision of a better future, and I think I'll wrap up there. So that's my personal email. You can also email me at my work email, which is evan@conservingcarolina.org. And if you're interested about vegan living or even just going more towards plant-based, this is a great resource, vegansociety.com. They have like recipes and different things like that about vegan nutrition and vegan cooking and all of that if you're interested.